Making sculpture might seem a rather odd and clumsy way to try and communicate and express yourself in the 21st century. Most things we want to communicate to one another. We can do very, very well verbally, we can do it in terms of scientific descriptions, but there is a particular area of human experience which I think, for lack of a better description, is the experience of inhabiting a physical body in a physical world, and the direct experience of that I think sculpture is superbly well placed to explore and express and communicate when other ways of communicating fail to be effective or articulate. The exhibition really grew out of two things. One was my preoccupation with patterns and the relationship between the tendency of things to be ordered and chaotic in nature and in growth particularly. And also from the amazing trip I did last year to Uganda, where I went with some Ugandan traditional musicians and classical musicians from the London Sinfonietta to investigate this phenomena of ancient stone gongs on the island of Lolawee in Lake Victoria. Having spent many, many years making work specifically for particular locations, it's very, very nice for me every now and again to have a very neutral and beautiful, clean space to show work in. In a way, the show falls into two parts. One are these new pieces I'm doing based on chaotic form which come from natural eroded boulders, which is about as mathematically chaotic as you can get, and combining that with very ordered forms, with spherical forms, to create a kind of rhythmic pattern over the surface, which is in some places very ordered and in some places very chaotic. The other part of the show will be these big painted canvases, which will go from ceiling to floor, down the wall 2 meters high and then 2 meters out onto the ground. And they'll be painted with these kind of complex patterns based on spots and dots, which is like this. So if you imagine this part of it will be up the wall, and then on the ground will be a boulder also painted with the same kind of patterns. And I think really what I'm interested in with this is a very simple idea of how sort of dots become lines, which could almost be thought of as notes. These points which coalesce to become phrases, and so in a sense it's like a visual version of something like improvised jazz, if you like. I've lived here on the edge of Dartmoor for just over 20 years now. Before that I lived in London. The landscape is important to me. I mean, I walk pretty much every day in the landscape. It's a very intimate, undulating landscape. It's a very sculptural and three-dimensional landscape with lots of hidden little valleys and nooks and crannies, and I like that very much. It's hard for me to say whether the landscape inspires my work directly. My work is particularly inspired by things which one finds in the landscape, organic forms, plant forms in particular. My work's always been inspired and informed by sort of observation of nature, really, and a fascination for the kind of patterns that you find in nature. And people often think that pattern is somehow a kind of superficial thing and confuse it with the idea of decoration. But if you study nature and you study the patterns in nature, you realise that it's absolutely fundamental. The thing is, when you see the manifestations of these things in the natural world, the underlying principles, the underlying geometric fundamental principles of these forms, you kind of perceive them by inference because they're never perfect. You never see the perfect Fibonacci spiral phyllotaxis on a sunflower. You never see the perfect archetypal oak leaf. So I think the dynamic tension that you feel between a tendency to things self-ordering and a tendency to things breaking down and becoming chaotic has become a really important theme in my work. And consequently, a lot of the work I've done recently has involved using as a starting point a chaotic form, very often an eroded boulder, very often glacial, erratic boulders. Very unpredictable. When a stone falls into a glacier and gets ground around for a few hundreds or thousands of years, in mathematical terms, it's about as close as you can get to a chaotic three-dimensional form. The actual process of making these things started off really with me playing about with ping pong balls and initially sticking them together to create clusters. I then started wondering what it would be like if I actually applied these ping pong balls to a random undulating surface. I decided to make fiberglass casts from the random boulders, which seems a slightly odd thing to do, but of course it's impossible to make a random shape. Sticking the balls onto that fiberglass, it would become a series of thousands of little pimples in different sorts of alignments. Then it was a matter of filling the gaps between the balls with fillers and bits of cloth and modelling the surface. But it's a very laborious process, and they've taken much, much longer than I would have ever imagined, but hopefully it'll be worth it in the end. These pieces that I'm making for the show will be cast in bronze, and actually they'll probably be painted or powder coated because I want them to be white. The way in which you get this wonderful tonal range with something that's white, you get from the very, very bright highlights on the top to really quite a deep shadow, which obviously reveals the rhythms of these little spheres fitting together. Well, nearly there, really. It's just a matter of how far we go with it. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
It's worked really well with them being more, you know, because there's more sticking out on the convex bits.
Yeah, these bits have been quite tricky, actually.
It'd be extraordinary to see it transformed into
yeah, I can't
metal.
wait to see it.
Casting is not the main way in which I've worked in the past. It's a fascinating process, and I have done 1 or 2 large casts. Usually in the past, the hollowness of the object has been very apparent in that I've had apertures so you can actually see the inside of the thing, because of course casts are, you know, they're basically hollow things on the whole. Whereas somebody working in stone like myself, and the way in which I work with stone, the whole idea of it being a solid volume is actually rather important, the idea that it's a mass of stuff. So this is very different, and I think it's quite a departure and quite an adventure, and I'm feeling my way with it, really. I must have bought about 10,000 ping pong balls altogether, and I probably used about 6,000 or 7,000 so far.
No, everything becomes ping pong balls. You start dreaming about it, and you wear the end of your fingers away.